gorgeous memorability that he loves to give us. And memory and dreamland and that oddly addictive place between the page and the eye are the settings for Julia Corpus's mysterious poems that try to pivot the self in time. Let's begin, though, with a bit of flash fiction on a Friday night. Part short story, part prose poem, part anecdote, part glimpse into a complex world. Tanya Hirschman is one of flash fiction's leading advocates and exponents in this country, writing it, teaching it and editing a journal called The Short Review. She worked for years as a science writer, but gave it all up for fiction, which is, after all, simply science with plots and believable characters. For the Verb, we've asked Tanya to write our first ever piece of flash fiction. She joined us earlier from the Verb's Bristol studio to read Massless.
"Quark me," he hissed, sliding up in the dark. "Go on, quark me." "No way," I said. "You're charmed, mate, if you think I'd—" "Bloody hell," he said. You're totally massless, you are, totally." And he held up his fingers right in front of my face. Gave me the boson, the sod. He always did like to mess with me, with my head. That was the last time. I've not seen him since. He made like a neutrino, just spun off, slipped away. I didn't worry at first. I had what to worry about, what to keep me busy with my particles and all that. Wasn't that enough? Didn't I have it snowed under? So I didn't miss him. But then, sudden, from one minute to the next, I felt him undone, like he'd been antied, like he'd been black-holed and no one cared, no one gave a flying fermion. Of course I went to the authorities and told them. I tried to, anyway. They looked like they were listening, looked like they were paying a Higgs bit of notice. They filed their whatevers under this and that. But I never saw a photon of evidence that they were searching for him, really searching. I still hear him, sometimes, on the edge of a dream. "Quark me," he's saying, whispering it softly, almost romantic. "Quark me, go on, just do it." And when I hear him, I wish I had. I really wish I had.
Tanya, thank you very much. That's a fantastic piece of writing. I wonder if you always found that sort of language exciting, even when you were a science journalist?
I definitely did when I was a science journalist. When I was actually studying physics, I was too worried about having to remember what all these things actually meant. So at least when I was a science journalist, it was okay to ask lots and lots of questions. But when I was a journalist, I was writing about so many different things, not just physics, all sorts of things, and technology, and everything was weird and wonderful. I loved it. But it's better now being a fiction writer because I just get to play with it.
Well, that's right. You seem to have taken charge of the language and put your own stamp on it. And I like the way you put the humour in, the way the quantum physics language, you say, "He gave me the boson." And that gives us a fantastic visual image, but also it releases us from being, as lay people, nervous of the language, doesn't it?
I think that's a really interesting point. I'm wondering whether I feel like I have license to do that with this language because I've studied some physics, and that probably if you haven't got a background in science, you probably feel that you have to stick with it and be very rigid with what these words mean to science. Whereas because I have a bit of a background, even though I'm not sure I could tell you exactly what a fermion was anymore, I feel like I'm allowed to be a bit playful. And I think humour's kind of important as well, because science is so often seen as quite rigid and black and white and not necessarily associated with anything funny.
But also, somehow this language gives this breakup between these almost lovers a kind of grandeur and mystery. When you say things like, "felt him undone," like he'd been anted, like he'd been black-holed and no one cared, you give it a real gloss of mystery there, I mean.
Oh, thank you. I didn't, it's hard to know how your own work is going to come across to other people, so that's really wonderful to hear.
But what it also does as well is it's almost like it's a private language between two scientists. You imagine if two greengrocers met each other. They'd use a kind of private greengrocer language. And these people,
yeah.
they feel like they call each other "my old turnip" and stuff, and yet these people feel like they're using a kind of private science language that, on the one hand, is beguiling, but on the other hand, is keeping us away in a way.
Oh, I really, really like that. I hadn't thought of that either. That's wonderful.
Now, flash fiction often seems to me to live or die by its endings. This one doesn't so much, but often with flash fiction you get a kind of a da-da at the end or a brunch.
Yeah, well, I think short stories in general are all about their endings, because you can't really have a great short story that has a weak ending. So flash fiction, these tiny stories, are sort of the essence of that and distill that right down. The whole sort of twist in the tail type short story endings are a little bit out of fashion now, but I guess anything goes.
That was Tanya Hirschman in our Bristol studio. A new collection of very short fiction is published by Tangent Books and is called My Mother Was an Upright Piano. The language in there was fantastic. Words like quark and neutrino. I like strangeness, which is a branch of charm, I believe. Paul, wasn't there a song called Quark, Strangeness and Charm?
Not one of mine.
This is not yours, Paul. I'm sure I remember a song that went Quark, Strangeness and Charm. So, Charles, this physics language has got amazing resonance, hasn't it?
It does. The term quark comes from James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake. As a young man, I was obsessed with this book. I used to go around telling people that in 200 years' time, all books would be written this way. Quark is meant to represent the sound of seabirds. And one of the things I learned this week is that there's a special kind of quark, which involves a quark-anti-quark pairing. And these things are called sea quarks, and they go around bumping into each other and obliterating each other. But I just thought it was a lovely twist on Joyce's maritime terminology.
Certainly is. Julia Corpus, do any of these words attract you?
Well, I know about the word gluon, which apparently is a type of boson responsible for the strong force between quarks. But to me, if I use that in a poem, I think I'd use the word gluon to refer to the sort of person who hangs on to you at a party that you can't get rid of. You know, they find you in the kitchen and they keep you talking for hours.
There's nothing worse than a gluon when they come towards you with their anecdotes. What about you, Paul? Some of this language of physics. And
I think boson, because it's like, I can imagine it's sort of like a buffalo-like particle that goes against the grain, you know, against the storm, because buffaloes go against the storm, don't they, and that's why they survive. And I can imagine a boson just goes flying through it, everything that's coming towards it.
It's fantastic, this language. And the great thing about this language is that for those of us that don't quite understand it, we can use it in a poetic kind of way. Strangeness, now, that really is a fantastic word. Now, Charles Fernyhough is a scientist and a psychologist and a novelist whose latest book, Pieces of Light, is an enthralling investigation of that thing we call memory. What's really exciting about the book, from the Verb's point of view, is that Charles puts forward the current thinking amongst neurologists that memories aren't simply stored in mental versions of filing cabinets or CD racks, but are reinvented, composed, almost written each time we fish for them. So memory is a creative thing. And what's also flabbergasting from a writer's and reader's point of view is that Charles manages to write about complex things in a clear and understandable way. So Charles, let's begin with an extract where you question your childhood memories of walking with your father along the River Blackwater.
After his divorce, my dad had found a welcome distraction in sailing. A friend of his, a whiskery schoolmaster named Monty Stanley, owned a 20-foot Bermuda sloop called Doralind, which he wintered in Malden and moored for the summer at West Mersey, a little further along the Blackwater coast. Dad had no investment in Doralind, but in return for his work on the boat, he got to sail with Monty whenever he wanted, and to bring us kids along when we were with him for the weekend. I was exposed to the mud early on. I would see it in the boatyard at Malden, where on winter weekends we would be painting the hull or trying to prise open tins of varnish with a screwdriver. The tide always seemed to be out, as though in conspiracy with my obsession. I wanted to know how deep a boy of my weight would go. Ankle deep? Knee deep? Would I really sink from sight completely? How many children in Malden's long history had been muddily snuffed out in this way? It trots off the tongue what Dad said to me about the mud and the complex fascination it inspired. It is the stuff of memoir, a vivid childhood memory freighted with significance, and now seeming to contain an incontrovertible truth about one's own life. But I've learned too much about the fallibility of memory to be taken in so completely. I'm pretty sure about the sensory impressions, the stink of the river bottom, its gleam under a reflecting sky. I don't doubt the remembered cries of black-headed gulls, the constant tink-tink of lanyards against masts. I'm confident about the part of the memory that relates to facts about my life, those autobiographical details about what I was doing at what point in time. It was after the divorce and before I started at boarding school, which puts my age as between 6 and 10. But that poignant story opener, my dad used to say, how much of that is my own making? I have no memory of him actually saying those words. In no version of the mental screenplay is he mouthing them. What I remember is the thought, you will disappear forever. Maybe what I want to say is that I know my father said it, Like I know that he was born in Newcastle-under-Lyme and that his last car was a Nissan Primera. But I might just as easily have put that warning into his mouth. It was my terror, after all, my fear driving the remembering. He is there in the memory, but his feelings are not propelling it. Memory serves its own master. It doesn't work for anyone's purposes except the rememberer's. I'm going back to this moment on my own terms, not anyone else's.
Charles, that is really fascinating, because you bravely allow us to enter and question the validity of your own memories as you interrogate the nature of memory itself. You question all kinds of details, your dad's words in that extract, the colour of the carpet in another memory. And in one chapter, it transpires you once wrote a scene based on a real pool you could never have visited. And surprisingly, to me, it turns out that a strong sense of emotional attachment to a memory is no guarantee at all that it's accurate.
That's right. Emotional events tend to be remembered better, but they sort of stick in the mind more strongly, but they're not necessarily any less prone to distortion than our other memories are. And I think it's just one of the ways in which we see how complex memory is as a process. There are so many different cognitive, psychological and neurological functions going on when we remember the past.
So interesting, because we often think of memory as a simple thing, and yet, as you say, it's complex. I know it's not the first time you've managed your own personal experience with science writing, but did you feel that this subject demanded it in some way?
My previous book was about my daughter's development, her psychological development in the first 3 years or so of her life. And there I was coming to this story, as a scientist who knew about this stuff in the abstract, as a writer who wanted to make sense of this amazing new experience, but also as a dad who felt so emotionally connected. And so the form that suggested itself to me there was a kind of science book that read like a novel. And when I was thinking about a topic to follow up on, memory seemed to work very well, because memories are about stories, memories are constructions, memories are in a sense fictions.
That's the thing about the fiction, because you say at one point in the book, memory narrativizes us. It turns us all into characters in a novel. And this understanding of memory is a creative process. Has that made you think about the original purpose of storytelling and why it's there?
One of the things we've learned from the new science of memory is that thinking about the past and thinking about the future seem to draw on similar processes, both in the brain but also cognitively in terms of what our minds are doing when we make sense of this information. What story gives us is a way of organising information, particularly information as it unfolds over time. Story allows us to put events together in time, and we need that when we're trying to make sense of our past. So I'm not trying to explain the ultimate function of storytelling. I think we should value stories in their own right. But there does seem to be an interesting evolutionary explanation for why thinking about the past and thinking about the future seem to fit together so well.
It's fascinating that neurologists' new model for memory seems to have got a lot in common with the way of thinking that Dark Ages monks would have understood. Could you explain something about the plan of St. Gall?
The medievals had a very sophisticated view of memory. What they remembered stuff for was in order to meditate, to create new thoughts about God, essentially. So they had a sense of memory as a reconstructive, recombinative process that would pull together different bits of information and stick them together in new ways. This is what the monks were up to for all those hours when they were meditating on spiritual matters. The plan of St. Gall is a real-life plan for an abbey that was never actually built. It dates from the 9th century. And Mary Carruthers, who's a medievalist in New York, has argued that this abbey was never meant to be built. What this beautiful plan represents is an aid to memory. The idea is that the monks would study this plan and they would populate this imaginary space with the stuff that they knew. And so to create new thoughts, all they had to do was kind of take a walk around this abbey and see new ideas combine in new ways every time.
So it is a way of bringing memories together. And since I read your book, I've started thinking differently, and you write very movingly in the book about that man whose memories of an accident he was involved in affected his life, and he was compelled to keep telling himself the story of that day almost every day. And I wonder how writing this book has given you a sense of how you might cope in such a trauma, given your understanding of how memory works. In other words, once you know how memory works, and if something happened to you, do you think you would then look at the recovery in terms of a narrative in a different way?
I like to think so. It's very hard to judge when you haven't been through those terrible experiences to know how you would react, and I think these are very difficult things to deal with. But I think for all of us, we can learn something from this new consensus about memory, and we can give ourselves a bit of a break. For example, I don't have particularly rich memories of my childhood. Why should I? Why is this assumption that we all have incredibly vivid memories of everything. I don't beat myself up over that. I don't beat myself up over the fact that I can't remember people's names. I can't remember basic information. I don't really care. That's not what my memory was designed for. It was designed for thinking ahead. It was designed for being creative, to my understanding.
That's a liberating thing to say. It really is. You know, it lets us off the hook in so many different ways. What interests me as well is that from the book I get the idea that there's no single objective version of the self. There's no single Charles Fernyhough writing the books. And that's something you chose to explore in your new novel, Box of Birds, because the heroine there has an unconventional understanding of the self, doesn't she?
That's right. Neuroscience is everywhere. We're constantly being told about this new way of understanding ourselves in terms of neurological processes, in terms of what our synapses are doing. And I thought, what if you took somebody who was really steeped in that stuff? She actually worked on this stuff for a living. She tried to understand the brain. Surely that would affect how she understood herself and possibly even why she chose to do what she did. So this is my question. Does knowing this new stuff about the brain actually change how we feel about ourselves? Does it change what we do? Is there a moral dimension to it? And so that's what I tried to explore in this story. Does this new understanding that Yvonne, my heroine, has, does it change how she feels about herself, how she behaves when things start to happen?
But you found also that fiction writers, and this is really interesting, find it hard to integrate this kind of thinking about the self into their work. So what do you make of their difficulty, do you think?
Fiction writers are very interesting on memory. I think we can learn an awful lot about how memory works by looking at how novelists construct memories for their characters. At the same time, sometimes novelists are very attached to a view of memory which is absolutely authentic, which suggests that when we remember something, we are really getting back to that original moment and recalling it in all its accurate detail. So I sometimes wonder why novelists don't celebrate the storytelling nature of memory a little bit more. The same applies to memoirs. You know, when you read a memoir, you're sort of told, you're being told, you know, this is actually how things were. But it wasn't really how things were. It's how you're choosing to tell that story at this moment in time.
Certainly is, and the book tells the story really, really well. Thank you very much to Charles Fernyhough. And Pieces of Light is out now from Profile, and his new novel, Box of Birds, is out with Unbound Books. Julia Copus is one of my favourite poets of the human heart, of the unexpected image, of phrases that come back to you when you least expect them, on the bus, in the bath, halfway through the news. Last night I sensed a taking root under the bone cage of my heart, a stirring, shifting, something not quite of a breath or heartbeat's weight. Her latest collection, The World's Two Smallest Humans, is concerned with time, how we perceive it as a fulcrum, a tipping point from past to future, from the perspective of the present. She writes of love, of children, and, like Charles Fernyhough, she explores the idea of what memory is and how we can sculpt it to make it sing. So, Julia, let's start with a poem, A Soft-Edged Reed of Light.
A soft-edged reed of light. That was the house where you asked me to remain on the eve of my planned departure. Do you remember? The house remembers it. The deal table with the late September sun stretched on its back. As long as you like, you said, and the chairs, the clock, the diamond-leaded lights in the pine-clad alcove of that 1960s breakfast room were our witnesses. I'd only meant to stay for a week, but you reached out a hand, the soft white cuff of your shirt open at the wrist, and out in the yard, the walls of the house considered themselves in the murk of the lily pond, and it was done. Done. Whatever gods had bent to us then to whisper, here is your remedy, take it, here your future. Either they lied or we misheard. How changed we are now, how superior after the end of it. The unborn children, the mornings that came with a soft-edged reed of light over and over, the empty rooms we woke to. And yet, if that same dark-haired boy were to lean towards me now with one shy hand bathed in September sun, as if to say, all things are possible, then why not this? I'd take it still, praying it might be so.
Seems to me that houses have got a special place in your poems. They seem to kind of encode memories for you, and they furnish you with telling detail. There's the pine-clad alcove, the diamond-leaded lights. Why is it, do you think, that houses let you play with memory so sensuously?
Well, I was interested in Charles's idea of this sort of imaginary house that's, or abbey that's built as an aid memoir, if you like. And I think houses seem to carry our identity. You've only got to think of television programmes like Through the Keyhole or Come Dine With Me, or that Writer's Room series that they do in The Guardian. We seem fascinated by looking into other people's houses and getting this kind of illicit glimpse, if you like, into their lives. But I think there's also a sense in which memories, as you say, become embodied by the houses that we live in. And there are 4 or 5 different houses in this new book. And at the start of the poem, the speaker says, "That was the house where you asked me to remain on the eve of my planned departure. Do you remember?" The house remembers it. And then the poem goes on to list various objects that were, present at that particular moment, which in that case happened to be the start of a relationship. So, the table where the couple was sitting at the time, the chairs, the clock, the windows, the cuff of a shirt, and so on.
So it's like these objects take on a kind of resonance because they were there in that house. But I wonder what interests me is how I've lived in the same house for 27 years.
Yeah.
And I wonder how long you have to live in a house for memories to start accumulating.
Well, I think partly we choose houses because they remind us of ourselves in some way. So it depends on the house that you happen to have ended up living in. But, it could be that the house that you live in embodies an awful lot of the memories over those 27 years that you've...
But it could be the same as well. If you live in a house for a month, it could start to embody things. Because what interests me as well about your work is your poetry often pivots around a particular moment, one that might have been overlooked at the time, but which the poem is able to weigh and sort of honour in a way properly. The poems don't necessarily argue for a different outcome to past events.
Yeah.
So what drives these recollections? Because often in the poems you go, well, this is how it was, this is how it is, and yet somehow by placing them there, you'd suggest that something else might happen.
Well, I think it's an acceptance of what actually has happened, but I have this fascination with time and the way we think about time, our attitude to time. And in fact, the ancient Greeks had different words for time. They had chronos, from where we get chronological, or sort of clock watch time, if you like. And that's the sort of time that we're most familiar with today, perhaps. But they also have this word kairos. And kairos refers, in essence, to a particular moment, a moment in which something extraordinary, perhaps even life-changing, takes place. And there are a lot of moments like that in this particular book. For example, there's a very long poem in the book. It's perhaps the longest poem, I think, about Franz Süssmayr. And it's Franz Süssmayr was Mozart's right-hand man, who was a amanuensis. And Mozart sent Süssmayr off to Baden with his wife, Mozart's wife, Constanza, while he was writing the Magic Flute. And Süssmayr helped in that process, but in fact, that plays a very small part in the poem. The important thing is this moment of kairos, this tiny, tiny moment when Constanza stumbles at one point and catches hold of Süssmayr's hand to steady herself, and at the same time her hair swings loose and brushes against him. So it's this tiny moment, but it's a moment of intimacy that changes Süssmayr for good. So that whole poem, that happens to be one of the longest in the book, centres around this very small moment of kairos.
That's what poems do, isn't it? Kairos is a great word for it. And Paul Heaton, you're great at capturing those moments in song. A lot of your poems capture particular moments, but also the song itself captures for the listener who they were and where they were at the moment they hear it. I remember when I hear Sail This Ship Alone, I remember I was in a car with my brother-in-law on the way to a gig. And is it the same for you as a writer? Do you remember where and when the inspiration first came for a song?
Yeah, I do actually, strangely. Well, certainly the inspiration, certainly the first couple of lines. I think nearly every song I've recorded, I can tell you where I was when I wrote it. It might only just be walking very near the house, passing such and such a bus stop. It doesn't have to be, you know, like any particular special place, because quite often, obviously, songwriting is a little bit different. It can come to you any time of day, any time, any place, really. But yeah, I do remember quite vividly most of where the first line was written. The rest after that is a case of taking the song somewhere else and sitting down properly.
It is this moment of kairos, it's this thing where the thing bubbles up. And it seems to me that, like Charles's book unites the impersonal world of science with the very human story, your work does something similar. So could you read Heronkind for us, Julie?
Yeah, of course. Whatever is desired is grown toward, a glimmer of fish at the margins of rivers and streams or in marshes triggers a longing, a muted, persistent itch in the newborn heron which she feels at the base of her fledgling bill, a sense that will persist until the optimal fish-spearing length is reached. From this point to eternity, her dreams are crammed with fish, or the nervy, darting shadows of fish. How much less complex life would be without this feverish dance between the wanter and the wanted, though the truth of it is that without fish, all heron kind would be stunted.
That poem represents, I think, the ability of yours to make sense of a kind of impersonal thing and personalise it. And that comes across in your sequence about fertility treatment, which is a very odd experience that we're only just starting to find ways of talking and writing about. And yet it's intimate and not intimate at the same time. I've invented the new term untimate. That's how the poems feel to me. Is that how it was for you? Writing them?
I think so, very much so, yeah. There have been a lot of very moving and wonderful and memorable poems written about the experience of parenthood, but I was interested in exploring this idea of imagined or longed for parenthood, and in particular that long journey through that territory or landscape that a couple embarks upon when they sign up for IVF treatment. And there is this extraordinary moment during the IVF process when the embryologist walks into the room with your two live embryos on the end of a pipette, kind of waving them around in the air. And she walks in a little scrub cap and tunic. And moments later, those same beings are transferred to your womb. So it is a very intimate poem, but, you know, as you say, conceiving a child is one of the most intensely personal things that can happen to you. But the process of IVF feels utterly dehumanising. And after a while, your body no longer feels like it belongs to you. So I wanted to communicate the strangeness, the almost surreal nature of medical intervention in a process that should be one of the most natural things in the world. So the occasional scientific word in that sequence, I don't use many, but, you know, pipette and blastocyst, for example, is there to convey that sense of alienation from the natural and that the woman feels from her own body.
And we're going to hear one more poem. We're going to hear Pledge, which is the last poem in the book. And it seemed to me you had to make a decision about whether the protagonist in the sequence would end up conceiving or not. So how did you come to that decision? Because that leads into the poem.
It does. You're right. There were two big narrative choices to make when I wrote this sequence. The first one was, would the woman end up pregnant or not? And the second one was then, how would she react to that outcome? And so, you know, in the sequence, the treatment doesn't work. And I think I chose that ending because it makes for a more open a more open ending, one in which, you know, if she'd fallen pregnant, that would be the end of the story, but she's not pregnant, so she then has a decision to make about her reaction to it. And so this is a poem which she speaks directly to her unborn child. Pledge. Chill, adrift in the deeps of the future, twiripe, yet to be son or daughter. If you had come out of your dark to where I am, these are the things you'd have chanced upon. Sunlight and the changeful air with its brood of noises, helicopter, dog bark, many song-filled, open-throated birds, the knocks and echoes of neighbouring yards, and the garden itself that all day long has been spawning bee-hum and shadow, endlessly, bee-hum and shadow. But you did not come, so I bide the while, calm, like a fishing net spreads itself wide under water. I give myself over, shell and shelter, child, my own. By and by, with the push of the wash, I'll usher you in.
Thank you very much to Julia Corpus, and The World's Two Smallest Humans is out now from Faber. You're listening to the season finale Verb with me, Ian McMillan. And because it's the season finale, this will be the last time for a couple of months that I'll be able to tell you that the show is available for up to 604,800 seconds on the iPlayer. And don't forget, the Proms Poetry Competition is open for business. We'd like you to write a poem in any style about a piece of music featured in this year's Proms. Myself and Wendy Cope are your esteemed judges, and the competition closes on August the 10th. A good day to be a grouse. For full terms and conditions, go to the Proms website, bbc.co.uk/proms, and follow the links to the competition page. Last time the great songwriter Paul Heaton came on the Verb, I said to him what I say to all songwriters we have on the show. We're very interested in pieces that stretch the idea of what a song can be, that contain music and words and end up being more than the sum of their parts. Paul's eyes twinkled in a Paul Heatonish way, and he said, I might have something for you there. And Paul's latest project is The Eighth. It's almost a song cycle, nearly a Brechtian drama, partly an opera, and not too far from a musical. What it definitely is what I imagine a song might dream of being when it's given as much time and space as it needs. The Eighth is about the 7 deadly sins from glutton via sloth to lust, and it invents a new one. And he's also on a songwriting roll with a new solo album coming out later this year. So, Paul, I'm right in thinking The Eighth itself came from a dream. Could you tell us about the dream?
I've never written a song before from a dream, but I woke up, and I'm not one to sort of bore people with my dreams, but I did tell somebody I sort of had this incredible dream. And it was about, the sort of like the usual sort of street scene, and with sins happening on the scene. And there's usually unholy alliances that happen on the street. On this one, all the usual alliances have been broken up. So all the sins have been broken up by talk of the eighth, an eighth sin, which seemed to be turning them all against each other. So it was quite a specific dream, and my friend said to me, you should write it down at least. And when I started writing it down, and when I started looking into the 7 deadly sins, I started to think of making it into one really long song. And then I eventually recorded it and performed it for the Manchester International Festival last year, and I'm currently touring it.
Well, what's the eighth? You did a dream of a new sin, the eighth sin, which is
the eighth was. I mean, it was roughly based on COINTELPRO, which was I think a CIA group or FBI group that had turned the Black Panthers against each other, and it was a similar thing to that. And the eighth sin is gossip. That's what I decided it would be. And so what was happening in the street scene that I'd been dreaming about was all the other sins were turned against each other by the planting of information and the gossip happening between them, and that's what was turned. And the police were using the eighth gossip to turn the sins against each other and finally rid the streets of those 7 sins.
It feels to me that when you had the dream, it was a very vivid moment, and one of those dreams where everything seems to happen at once, and yet it seems to have a narrative. I just wonder what was the process of then turning that from the dream to the page, to writing down. Was it a long process?
Well, weirdly enough, because it was such a specific dream, a friend who said you should write it down, I didn't need to. And again, with song lyrics and certain song melodies, you don't need to. I always think if it's a good melody, I'll remember it. And I sort of did, and I remembered the rough scenario enough to realise that I'd sort of got 3 or 4 clues in the crossword of the song already. So I took some time, finished doing what I was doing, which was songwriting for another album at the time, and then sat down at home and did it. And just gradually looked up about the sins, because I wasn't aware of all of them and what they meant. And obviously there's a few similarities between some of the sins with gluttony and greed, and really I had to write a song not only about the sins, but also one that linked the sins together in some sort of order and also related to the eighth as well. So it was quite a complicated thing to write.
But that was the thing about, because you're well known for writing beautifully short pop songs. So how lyrically challenging was it to write this thing that you describe? And it's right as one long song.
Well, it was like making, I mean, most songs, most short pop songs, it's like doing a fairly quick jigsaw, or maybe a complicated crossword, something like that. But this was like a jigsaw of jigsaws. Once I had the first bit, it also had to fit in with the other parts as well. So it was a long process. It took me as long to write the whole thing as it would do maybe a couple of albums, because they had to link in and they had to sort of make sense within each other. So it took 2 months or so to write the lyrics. But that was at home, so I had my distractions at home. It's not my normal place that I write.
Let's hear a clip.
When patrol car approached the same-sex couple, they were kissing in their usual spot. When the feds whispered to the younger of the two, there's something here you may have forgot. Lust was just a wind that battered every neighborhood. Mistrust was just a gale right behind. Carried on the storm of collusion and confusion was the dust that turned the seeing to the blind.
Lust was just a wind that battered every neighbourhood. That's a fantastic line. It's always been said that the devil has all the best tunes. Would you fancy doing a follow-up that was the 7 deadly virtues? Or wouldn't that be as interesting?
Well, it would be interesting, yeah. I think people might tire of it slightly. But I do fancy writing another story song, you know, a song that dealt with more than just one issue, you know. I think I have to be careful to space these things out, you know, for my fans' sake, that they wouldn't want to... Because I was playing in Sheffield last night, and there's quite a shocking sort of... you know, it's quite in your face, the whole production. We have Reggie Cathy from The Wire doing like a parallel narrative. And it's quite surprising, particularly for my fans who are used to sort of like 3-minute pop songs. So I think I have to space these projects out a little bit.
And it's interesting to me that how you do things seems to be as important as what you do all right. And is that why you chose, on your last tour, the one before this, to cycle between all the gigs?
Yeah, I mean, interestingly enough, when Charles was talking about memory, I did a lot, you know, like at 10, 15 years of playing arenas, and I can't remember any of the arenas, but cycling to these pubs, I can remember every single landlord and landlady's names, and I can remember the pub, and I can remember the journey, and I can remember the journey vividly as well. So I should be reading Charles's book, really, to explain why, because I don't think that's particularly selective. I've been selective about the arena pass because, of course, in arenas you're just coming into a city, you're maybe staying on the outskirts of a city, you're playing a building that looks pretty similar, whether it's Birmingham or Sheffield or London. And so it was a really, really good, again, sensory experience for me, you know, like to go out and like, to be cycling to a gig and to see an oyster catcher and a curlew and things like that is just, I don't know, it's just very special.
And somehow it seems to me that in the process of writing, you write in your different Paul Heatons when you write.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's weird because occasionally you have people saying, "Oh, was this song written about me?" You know, I'm talking about fanatical fans, and they're not. They're not really written about anybody, and they're not really written from one person's view anyway. So I do have to put on a different shirt for different sort of attitudes in songs. Yeah, I suppose you do that in life anyway. You know, quite often you'll turn around to a friend and talk very differently than you would to, you know, your son or daughter or your dad or your mother. You do put on different characters in different situations, and it's a case of doing that on paper, you know, being fatherly or motherly or sisterly, brotherly. Something.
Yeah, because we're going to hear a song in a moment from your new solo album. And has that got a theme, or are you just trying to write with different songs?
No, it hasn't got a theme yet. We've written the lyrics and we've written the tunes, but we'll only be recording it next year. But no, there's no particular theme. The song we're playing is sort of almost like a Shirley Valentine type story of a woman going away and meeting a man who is attractive because of the setting, mainly, you know, and I think we've all felt that at times.
What's it called?
Costa Del Sombre.
Costa Del Sombre. Well, thank you very much to Paul Heaton and my other guests, Charles Fernyhough, Tanya Hirschman and Julia Copas. The Verb's back in September, and I'll be spending my summer in the flesh pots of Europe. Note to self, must check if Skegness, Jedburgh and Lowestoft count as flesh pots. If you see me on the street, come and say hello. And if you say, "You are Ian McMillan, and I'm a loyal Verb listener, and I also remember Quark, Strangers and Charm as a song by Hawkwind," it'll make my day. Let's finish the Verb year with a song from Paul Heaton. Here's Costa Del Sombre.
Fully covered up on an oily beach, flat or apartment just a little out of reach. An ignorance of language but a love of speech. Costa Del Sombre. Deliberately using words he knows are incorrect. Broken English brings a kind of new respect when he tries to say he's sorry in local dialect. The gulf between. She was sort of lonely. He was lonely too. So when they both took to the dance floor, they knew just what to do. Yes, sorry, could boogie, but she could boogie too. The steps she'd been saving up since 1972. A desperate little feeling that you lost in life, that every minute an ex-husband gains a second wife, that the sun that blinds you now one day will twist the knife. Costa del Sombre. Speaking different language but it's loud and clear. The dark eyes of the picador are about to spear. It's the very reason she feels so wanted here. The gulf between. She was sort of lonely. He was lonely too. So when they both took to the dance floor, they knew just what to do. Yes, sorry, could boogie, but she could boogie too. The steps she'd been saving up since 1972. Halfway to Villa Verde, from the old village green, coats and conversation, through sombrero dreams. When conversation's lively and home life's so dull, and the sun burns up your face, just yards from your skull. She was sort of lonely. He was lonely too. So when they both took to the dance floor, they knew just what to do. Yes, sir, he could boogie, but she could boogie too. The steps she'd been saving up since 1972.
The Verb was presented by Ian McMillan and produced by Faith Lawrence.
What is